right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, my name is Zach Ryan. I am a current graduate student at Indiana University in the School of Education. It's my first year as a graduate student in the Learning Sciences program in the School of Ed. This will be a presentation on Japan and its education system for an international STEM education seminar led by Dr. Adam Maltese in the Department of Science or STEM Education at Indiana University. So I'm going to be talking about Japan and its education system in relation to STEM education and certain concepts revolving around STEM education, such as innovation, creativity, and play. This is going to be a kind of stream of consciousness video, so I might stumble over my words here and there, so please bear with me. I'm not an expert video editor, so I'm going to try and record this in one shot. All right, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so starting off with a little bit of history of Japan. So throughout its history, Japan has always been an independent country. And what I mean by that is, while it's had many shifts and changes in its government and its government structure, it's always been ruled and controlled by people of Japanese descent. So that being said, there's been several education reforms throughout history. Formal education in Japan began with the adoption of Confucian and Buddhist teachings from China sometime in the 6th century. Throughout its history, education, like in most places, was restricted mostly to the upper class, bureaucrats. However, that began to change during the Edo period when temple schools, or terrakoya, began to educate nearby peasants where the temples were located. Monks would go out and educate peasants. So that was kind of a shift in who was starting to receive education in Japan. And that moved forward into the Meiji Restoration of 1868, where methods of Western learning were adopted to sort of modernize the country after its borders reopened. This is the first time that we see compulsory education introduced into Japan. And then it was like that until around post-World War II, where the most recent radical reformation in education took place after Japan was defeated in World War II by the Allied forces. The Allied forces, mainly the U.S., had heavy influence on Japan's restructuring of government as well as education. So one of the goals of this reformation was to, so to speak, get rid of militarist and imperial teachings of pre-war Japan in a way to pacify Japan. But this is the sort of modern system that can be seen today in Japan, the structure of it at least, that we'll talk about momentarily. Currently, Japan is a country of 126 million people. 12% of those people are under the age of 18 and most likely in some form of schooling. Japan currently has a GDP of 44,426 as of, I think, 2015, and currently leads industries in motor vehicles, electronics, machine tools, and robotics. So, taking a look in education in context, so to speak. Education in Japan is controlled at the federal level by the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology, or MEXT for short, M-E-X-T. Compulsory education begins at the age of 6, right around here, and lasts until the age of 15. So 9 years of compulsory education, 6 years of elementary, and 3 years of lower secondary school, with one key national exam at grade 9 that is heavily emphasized. Elementary school and lower secondary school in Japan look quite different from each other. In fact, starting at grade 7 up until you finish upper secondary school, which isn't compulsory but often finished by students, there is a very heavy testing culture. Even though there's only one national exam that students take in grade 9, there's still a very heavy testing culture on local and regional, like prefecture exams for students. It's a very high pressure environment for students to be in. It's actually a point of criticism in the Japanese educational system. There are some critics that point to the high pressure situation for students as a detriment to students' mental health, as students are often bullied for low academic test scores by other students, and this sort of system perpetuates by teachers and parents expecting the best from students nonetheless. So normally the academic year is divided into 3 trimesters, April 1st to July 20th, September 1st to December 26th, and January 7th to March 25th. There are exceptions to this, but this is the norm. So almost all students continue on to upper secondary school or high school from lower secondary school. And here we can split off into sort of different tracks that students can take. Most students take upper secondary high school, which resembles high school in America or other parts of the world for the most part. But there are also technical colleges as well as specialized training for students planning on going into certain trades. And there's also other types of school as well, such as super science high schools, which we will talk about later on in the presentation, where a select group of students who excel in both science and mathematics get to go to a more project-based school. But we'll dive into that later. Following high school or upper secondary school, students can choose to continue to university or a junior college or some sort of professional training school, depending on what their kind of track was in high school beginning with. Normally, these schools contain some form of entrance exam that is distributed by the individual schools. So different universities will have different university entrance exams, or trade schools will have some form of entrance exam as well. And these are all, much like other tests, very high pressure for students. It's kind of make or break for them, which leads to a very high stress and high pressure environment from around age 12 onwards for any amount of time that they're in school after that. All right, so moving into how Japan deals with STEM and STEAM. STEM and STEAM, for anyone that does not know, is science, technology, engineering, sometimes arts, and mathematics. STEM was kind of the first one, and STEAM came later with an emphasis on administering more arts into what STEM is. And STEM, for anyone that, again, does not know, is a way to sort of integrate these subjects presented here into a single curriculum so that students can see how they influence one another, how they work together within industry, and how they produce innovation throughout different fields. And this can manifest in many different ways in the real world, which is why it's become such a heavy emphasis internationally. So STEM for Japan right now still consists mostly of science and mathematics, with technology and engineering kind of putting on the back burner until university level, where there's programs to be engineers or computer scientists, et cetera, et cetera. One thing that Japan has started to do recently is the inception of super science high schools for select students that are excelling in science and mathematics. And these are project-based schools like we see here in the US, where students carry out a variety of projects throughout the year incorporating different subjects, different content, different contexts, carrying them out throughout the school year. At the end of these super science high schools, at the end of their kind of student careers there, they conduct a senior thesis where they design and pursue their own research project based on an amalgamation of the things that they've learned throughout the 3 years there. If you would like to learn more about this, there are links here and here, and I will be sure to include them in the link to the video if you're watching this through a video, through YouTube or whatever else this is put on. And while, like I said, engineering and technology are kind of put on a little bit of a back burner in formal education programs, there is growing interest that Japan has taken in to try and implement these more university-level programs into primary and secondary schools. For example, in 2020, Japan is planning to introduce programming to elementary schools to teach students, young students in particular, logical thinking. To do this, they are planning on using the Scratch software out of Harvard University that has had yielded wide success across the US and many other countries for young students to learn the basic concepts of programming and logical thinking. And I will also provide a link to Scratch software if anyone is interested in learning more about that. Okay, moving on to sort of different aspects of STEM and STEAM education. We have making, which currently in Japan, well, for starters, making is, as you might guess, literally making something. However, there has been sort of kind of a conception of the idea of this makers movement, promoting the education and learning of how to make things, or using different technologies or methodologies to make things. And so, for example, the use of things like 3D printers or laser cutters have helped to integrate more of the arts and making into kind of technology and STEM as a whole. So in the US, for example, we have things like maker spaces or FabLabs where they'll have a variety of resources, fabrics, wood, 3D printers, laser cutters, anything that you can make things with. And it'll be an open space for people to come in to make and create. And so this is just starting to gain popularity in Japan. More and more Fab Labs have begun to open, and there's a link here for anyone interested in the Fab Lab movement in Japan. But currently there is no implementation with them or the making movement into schools. However, Japan does have a national science competition for junior and high school level students to compete in that heavily involves making. So this consists of 2 sections, this national competition, which is held annually. Consists of a paper and a crafts test. The paper test, as you might guess, is more just kind of theory based on science, mathematics principles that students are supposed to know coming into this competition. And then there is a craft test. And in the craft test, students must make something that is announced on the day of the competition, kind of on the spot, with limited resources. If you'd like to learn more about that, there's a link to a YouTube video here that kind of highlights one of the year's competitions. And you can see students making a variety of different things. Okay, moving on to creativity and how that manifests in education. So, in Japan, creativity seems to be, first off, creativity is a very broad term and certainly cannot be defined in one statement. I certainly cannot define it. But I will lay out sort of qualifications that we used in our class to discuss creativity. So creativity comes from sort of creating or utilizing resources from a novel or personal perspective. The key element here is that it's novel or personal to a person, and it stems from sort of an unorthodox or original thought process. And so creativity is often framed in the way of solving problems, and while it certainly can be used to solve problems, it doesn't have to be exclusively. For example, this GIF or GIF doesn't necessarily solve a problem, but it takes a creative spin on a famous piece of artwork. For education in Japan, creativity seems to be directly tied into play and innovation, which we will discuss in the coming slides. And so this mainly manifests in younger students in education, elementary school. So, for example, play for the Japanese, they believe it stimulates creativity in children. And so in formal education, this is present only in young children, directly in the classroom. It manifests in later ages in junior and high school through more extracurricular activities, but that can vary as well, given that not all students take the same extracurriculars. Although creativity does seem to be directly encouraged within the super science high schools discussed earlier, where students are encouraged to write their own thesis and develop a project of their own, as well as take creative approaches within their curriculums, within their project-based curriculums. But the super science high schools are very selective and exclusive in the students they admit in. So these forms of creativity within formal education are not accessible to all students, only a handful of students. Okay, moving on to innovation. These are all tied heavily to each other, at least in the Japanese education system. So innovation can be defined as an original or unique creation and or use of resources or technology. It can be done or used to accomplish a goal or fulfill a purpose or solve a problem, but it is doing something is the key. So, doing something new, I should say as well. So within the Japanese educational system, there's a big split in innovation across elementary schools and junior and high schools. For example, elementary schools, teachers invest significant time in developing what they consider to be innovative capability. For example, in a social studies classroom, you might have teachers send students out into their communities and interview local shops to learn how they make a profit. The teachers will then host a sort of marketplace activity within their classrooms where the students can set up shop, so to speak, and buy and sell different items using imaginary currency in order to learn about how profit is made in small businesses within their community. Or for arts, for example, on a more general scale, instructors might give students a theme of work, and students kind of get free rein to create what they want. For example, a teacher may say to create their future living space and not really provide any kind of restrictions on what students can do or how students can make that. Moving into junior high and high school, teachers emphasize a very rigid sort of knowledge-oriented instruction, which typically means that there is one way, one method, one approach to answer something, usually one problem, and there's usually one solution to that problem as well. In this sense, innovation seems to severely be lacking outside of those super science high schools where innovation is encouraged in the project-based approaches, but I hesitate to go into detail about them because that is not the significant majority of what students experience within those older grades. Most students are within those knowledge-oriented curriculums where innovation is kind of stifled from formal education, which is a point of criticism in the current system, as Japanese students that tend to study abroad overall have a hard time adapting to the more open kind of loose way that certain higher education establishments can carry out curriculum, whether it be inquiry-based or project-based. They struggle with it when they study abroad, or even move into the university space where inquiry-based approaches or play-based approaches to education are slowly starting to be implemented. Okay, so moving on to the concept of play, also a very broad term that can't really be boiled down to any one statement, but for the purposes of this video and our class that we participated in, I'll try to sum it up. So play is an ambitious exploratory space for individuals to be in order to augment some sort of experience without the inherent risks that come with those experiences. For example, children playing house do not have the inherent risks of being an adult and having to pay taxes on a house and worry about the overall general worries that adults do. An easier example of that would be being a superhero, where the innate danger of being a superhero is not present in play. These play consists of interactions where there are rules behind it, and each player of play, no matter what kind, has a role and goals behind their engagement in play, whether that's just to have fun or they want to accomplish some other extrinsic goal or intrinsic goal. And so it also provides a way for children to learn certain social behaviors or sociocultural skills to develop without facing certain consequences, such as dealing with negative social interaction within play, but then outside of play, quickly making up with an individual. And so play provides these sort of things for children of all ages, not just young children. So in Japan, in the 1980s, Japan introduced what's known as Yutori education, which was a kind of which they known as cram-free education, which was a more relaxed and flexible curriculum for students after the sort of high-pressure environments that students were in had been criticized a bit too much. So overall, total lesson time for students decreased, and students had spare time for playing out in playgrounds or participating in extracurricular activities known as jukus. And this provided, in Japan's eyes, more opportunities for play development. And so Yutori, ironically, it was a response to these sort of high-pressure environments, Yutori began to be criticized in Japan when Japan's international test scores, such as TIMSS and PISA test scores, dropped. They were leading the world in both science and mathematics, not necessarily first, but they were in the top 10 to be certain, and they dropped down a few ranks following Yutori education, and Yutori education began to be heavily criticized, and so more and more it kind of decreased and decreased until finally in 2011 Yutori was considered to be ended when study time increased for the first time in about 30 years in 2011. So play is still an important part of education. It mainly manifests in K through 2 education. The Japanese believes that play promotes a creative mind, especially in K through 2. And I have linked a video here and here. I'll provide it in the description as well for anyone that's interested in how play manifests within elementary schools. It also manifests itself within pre-kindergarten as well. That's not part of the compulsory education, but Japan is putting a much more heavy emphasis on pre-K education, trying to get access to pre-K for all citizens of Japan in a more equitable fashion. Moving on though, play is still present later on in junior high and high school through extracurricular activities such as jukus, such as sports or science clubs, things of that nature, but it doesn't necessarily manifest itself within the classroom at that higher level. Like I said, it's a very, what they describe as knowledge-oriented, very procedural, very pragmatic sort of linear approach to education. If you'd like to learn more about play and how it manifests in Japan, I've linked an article here discussing how in their preschools play is a huge emphasis. Okay, so we can move on then. Actually, let's see. Yep, so that kind of covers how the Japanese educational system handles it's how STEM manifests within the Japanese educational system, as well as elements related to STEM education, such as play, creativity, making, innovation, all sort of manifest themselves in formal education within Japan. Should it be pretty clear at this point that these concepts are valued in Japanese culture and in Japanese society, but mainly present within the elementary schools and sort of stripped away as students get into the more high-pressure testing environments where the test is what matters, where kind of creativity, play, and innovation is sort of sacrificed for the sake of that knowledge-oriented curriculum. So in terms of recommendations for the Japanese education system, my main recommendation would be for Japan to sort of begin to implement these elements from elementary school up into the junior and high schools. Super science high schools are a good place to start. They're just simply limited in scope. They're limited to a few students, excluding many, many others. And I think other students could really benefit from the example of super science high schools. We've seen the heavy emphasis of the connections between play, innovation, and creativity that the Japanese have within their culture. And these sort of connections within education could serve older students just as much as younger students if implemented in the appropriate way. For example, incorporating elements of play into some form of inquiry-based lessons within their curriculum could help students further develop their creativity as well as new ways of learning. I've linked an article here encouraging kids to think for themselves that discusses this a little bit more. Japan also has a highly trained teacher force. Their teachers are very highly trained, and it's very, in the culture, it's a well-respected profession to take. And so in these kind of rigid, knowledge-oriented environments, teachers often ask students to expand on their thinking or their problem solving, much like you would see in an inquiry-based curriculum. Japan also has a reasonably equitable education system. They have state-controlled salaries for teachers and equitable distribution of both teachers and resources across the country, which in my opinion lends itself to these kinds of changes that could be made within the system. Overall, I would emphasize the already existing elements of inquiry-based or even play-based education within Japan's own education system at the elementary level, and begin to encourage the country to look at how much of a wider influence these approaches can have for students, particularly as they get older into high school. These kinds of approaches could also alleviate the intense high-pressure testing environments that are within Japanese society and lead to further learning, methodologies of learning for students. A contact of mine from Japan, Dr. Yoshinori Oyama, who has helped me immensely put together this information, seems to agree with me on this, as he is currently working to implement various inquiry-based learning methodologies into higher education in Japan. and sees fit that they trickle down into the rest of the education system as well. And with that being said, I would like to offer a big thank you to Dr. Yoshinori Oyama, who has helped me to collect resources as well as offer me invaluable insight into how the Japanese education system is structured and put together, and the overall nature of Japan and how it regards education. So thank you very much, Dr. Oyama. You've been an amazing help. I will provide any links that I provided in this slideshow in the description of this video. I hope this was a help to anyone looking to learn a little bit more about Japan and its education system in regards to STEM education and ideas surrounding STEM. Thank you very much. This has been Zach Ryan.